What's that?
Good evening, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Pastor, cover your ears. Don't forget, October 15th is Pastor Appreciation Day. If you would like to give a love offering, you can see Pam or Marilyn for that. We will be doing a potluck dinner after service. Please do not bring desserts because we are having some desserts made special for this. So if you would like to attend, please bring something, not a dessert. October 14th is our craft fair here at the church. It's getting close. If you would like to be a vendor, you can reach out to Kim Montgomery. If you would like to come shop, you are all welcome, and you're welcome to invite people, share it on Facebook. This is a nice way that we can get people from the community into our church and get information about the church while they're here shopping. And September 16th, coming up, is the men's golf outing. If you have any questions about that, you can see Earl. And I think that's everything, right, Marilyn? For the, okay, if you know a food truck vendor, which I might know some.
Yeah, Marilyn, get with either one of us after service.
Yeah. So we're gonna have food trucks at the craft fair, maybe. All right, I'll turn it over to Andy.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to our Wednesday night Sunday school. As some people call it, just Bible study. Everybody hear me okay? There's not an echo or feedback. They fixed me up with a revamped mic tonight, so we shouldn't have the issues we had before. And as I get my stuff ready here, we have outlines that Chelsea has in the back. If you haven't received one already, if you're watching online, we can also email those to you if you're interested. There is a handy chart on the back there, just so you can kind of track. If you're like me, it helps to know where these things fall in the historical timeline. So there's a handy little chart there that shows the years. It shows what the milestone is that we're discussing. And then next to that will be the scripture that corresponds with that. And sister, did you get one? I saw you looking back there. She's got one. Okay. So we're going to start out a little bit with some other discussion because, as always, when we do these studies, we like to reflect on how this fits with the culture of the day, how it applies to our lives. Everything in Scripture, regardless of whether it was in 900 BC or not, does apply to our lives where we're living today. And we see a lot of things that some of the same individuals, like Elijah, were dealing with that we deal with today. It's some of those things in our culture that are pretty shocking. So just to refresh a little bit, we won't spend too much time, but we are going to be in the rest of 1 Kings chapter 18. We know that the prophet has stood up against King Ahab. He's pronounced that drought. That's going to be 3.5 years. And we've been in that 3.5 years. We watched him go from Kerith to Zarephath. We talked about the faith that it took for him to do that. And this drought that's happening is going to affect everybody. There's going to be some effects of this that affect everyone from richest to poorest, from greatest to least. One of those byproducts of this drought, of course, is, you guess, it's probably that famine, and that's going to be pretty tough to deal with. Man or beast are not spared. It's going to be some pretty lean years, that 3.5 period of time. So everything's affected: economy, agriculture, infrastructure, probably even the morale of the people, I would say. But keep in mind, their leadership has led them into this pagan belief system. And just to recap, that's going to be something promoted by King Ahab, really encouraged by Jezebel, who came from Sidon and brought those Phoenician beliefs into Israel. And now they've not only introduced that false system alongside of the true worship of God, but they actually want to replace that. And so what we've seen is Ahab putting altars in temples devoted to Baal. And at the same time, we've seen Jezebel, who has erected those Asherah poles, Asherah being the consort to Baal, or Baal, as you may have heard him called sometimes in the past. And so we're going to see that famine, but famine comes in different forms. And what we discover is that famine doesn't really indicate exactly what you think it might. Now, we all probably grew up, Bob gave me a National Geographic tonight. It made me think a little bit, it's about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it made me think a little bit about the ones we would have in our classrooms when I was growing up. And I came up with those images, and I would always see like the Ethiopian famine. How many remember that? That was kind of like the big thing in the late 70s, early 80s. And so when I always thought of famine, I always thought of those poor Ethiopians, that they always feature those kids on those magazines. But what we find out is that in the case of famine, when famine comes as judgment, it's going to be a result of some other things. And contrary to the idea of it being a famine that we're without food, we're without water, we get all those things. We understand what the basic definition of a famine is. But do we understand that when that comes in the form of judgment, that that's going to be a result not of famine, but of overindulgence? And I wanted to share a little bit with you tonight because last week we reflected on the Screwtape Letters a little bit to tie that in by C.S. Lewis. And I wanted to introduce you to something else. Has anybody ever read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis? Probably one of the most influential apologetic works, at least in the 20th century. It's considered today probably one of the best works when it comes to the introduction of faith to people. So I highly recommend it. And of all things we're going to talk about is going to be part of his chapter on sexual morality. And you say, well, what does that have to do with Elijah? Well, believe it or not, what it has to do with in this study is the idea of famine. Because I want to read something that he wrote, and I might not need my glasses, but let me read this to you for just a minute. He writes this: the biological purpose of sex as children, just as the biological purpose of eating, is to repair the body. Now, if we eat whenever we feel inclined and just as much as we want, it is quite true most of us will eat too much, but not terrifically too much. One man may eat enough for 2, but he does not eat enough for 10. The appetite goes a little beyond its biological purpose, but not enormously. But if a healthy young man indulged his sexual appetite whenever he felt inclined, and if each act produced a baby, then in 10 years he might easily populate a small village. That makes a lot of sense. The appetite, he says, is in ludicrous and preposterous excess of its function. Or take it another way, you can get a large audience together. Brace your ears. By the way, this is probably for adults only if you're watching at home. Or take it another way, he says, you can get a large audience together for a striptease act. Don't act like you don't know what that is. That is to watch a girl undress on the stage. Now suppose you come to a country where you could fill a theater by simply bringing a covered plate on the stage and then slowly lifting the cover so as to let everyone see, just before the lights went out, that it contained a mutton chop or a bit of bacon. Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with the appetite for food? And would not anyone who had grown up in a different world think there was something actually queer about the state of the sex instinct among us? One critic said that if he found a country in which such striptease acts with food were popular, he would conclude that the people of that country were starving. He meant, of course, to imply that such things as the striptease act resulted not from sexual corruption, but from sexual starvation. I agree with him that if in some strange land we found that similar acts with mutton chops were popular, one of the possible explanations which would occur to me would be famine. Can you imagine that you go into a theater, you pay your money to go in, the windows are all covered, the lights go out, the light comes on the stage, and up lifts this little veil to reveal a delicious pork chop. Think about it. And if that was the entertainment, if somebody lured you in, you got to come in here. Come on, American, come on in here. So it's cheap, come on in. You go in there and you watch that, and you'd go, what am I watching here? This is not what I thought it was. Shame on you for thinking otherwise. Your mind's in the gutter. But the point is this: you go in there and you're like, what is up with these people? They're getting their enjoyment out of watching a plate of food. That's kind of weird. Clearly, they're hungry for pork chops or mutton chops or whatever you want to call it. Lewis goes on to say this, but the next step would be to test our hypothesis. And here's where it gets tricky. By finding out whether, in fact, much or little food was being consumed in that country. If the evidence showed a good deal was being eaten, then of course we should have to abandon the hypothesis of starvation and try to think of another one in the same way before accepting that sexual starvation as the cause of the striptease. We should have to look for evidence that there is, in fact, more sexual abstinence in our age than in those ages when things like the striptease were unknown. But surely there is no such evidence. So in other words, are we starved for stripteases in this country, I would argue that we have plenty, that there are plenty of places to go for that kind of entertainment. And hang with me, I realize this is getting into uncomfortable territory, but Lewis makes a point here. He says this, contraceptives, now keep in mind, this is from a series of radio broadcasts he did beginning in 1941, August of 1941, up through the 1940s until its publication in 1952 into a book. So all these broadcasts he did for the BBC were condensed into this book. So it's 1952, so we're going back a little ways here, but listen to what he says because he's ahead of his time. He says, contraceptives have made sexual indulgence far less costly within marriage and far safer outside of marriage than before, and public opinion is less hostile to illicit unions and even to perversion than it has been since pagan times. We're talking something written 70 years ago. Nor is the hypothesis of starvation the only one we can imagine. Now here's what you want to listen to. Everyone knows that the sexual appetite, like our other appetites, grows by indulgences. Starving men may think much about food, but so do gluttons. The gorged as well as the famished like titillations. So what he's suggesting is there are these certain behaviors solely talking about sexual behaviors, sexual starvation to be specific, is really an oversimplification. He's using that analogy of those striptease acts and that uncomfortable topic we talked about because you guys have never heard of those before. He uses that analogy to discuss how that hypothesis has to be abandoned. You can't say that America has a problem with everything, and let's not think striptease for a minute, since that one's hard to imagine. Nobody's ever seen that before. But you turn on your television, right? Or you get a homework assignment from the school. I was talking to somebody today that actually pulled their child out of a school system because of the things they were being exposed to, and the school board wouldn't stand behind her. When you look at all these things around us, you can't say there's an obsession with sex and perversion, because it's actually gone beyond just sex. Sex in and of itself within marriage obviously is not bad. God created it. But I'm talking about the oversaturation of sex. Who thinks I'm way off base here? Who thinks that there is maybe a problem? I think there's a problem. I'm in that latter group. I think there's a problem in our culture today with that oversaturation. What does this have to do with Elijah? Well, what this has to do with Elijah is we have replaced those foundational truths in our country and the biblical things that we know are right and wrong, the absolute truths that people haven't been brave enough to stand up for, and we've let these things creep in. And now we're in a place where we can't say that there's so many sexually saturated things out there because we just don't talk about it enough. I get sick of hearing it, amen? It's all the time. With the case of this particular vice, there's this oversaturation and overindulgence. So what happens is we have to throw that hypothesis out the window and say it has nothing to do with the limitations. We have more access to sex and perversion than ever before, yet we're being flooded with it. Why is that? Because it's an overindulgence, and it begins with us first, the first step, walking away from our covenant with God. Yes, sir.
Andy, this is a question. Do you think that Republicans and Democrats, main media, that they're trying to portray what you're talking about as the norm in our society now?
Yeah, most definitely. They want to normalize it. And there's plenty of examples. We could do a whole series on just some of those examples, but judging by the looks on your faces when I said the word striptease, which nobody uses that word anymore anyway, we probably wouldn't do a study on that. But yes, to answer Brother Ron's question, they do want to normalize it. And it goes across party lines, because the fact of the matter is, you don't have to be a pervert to belong to one party, although we see it more celebrated probably in one party than another. We see it across the board. So if you start to think, well, Democrats are perverted, we could probably take about 30 seconds and uncover a lot of things through a simple search on the Google machine that would show us Republicans guilty of the exact same thing. So it goes across party lines. It is a not political problem. It really is a sin problem. It's a problem that deals with people because people are sinful and we're flawed. So that's an exactly true statement what Brother Ron says. The problem that we have with these overindulgences, and we break covenant, and we have these overindulgences, we need people like Elijah. In Elijah's day, these overindulgences were taking place because of the covenant. Elijah wasn't on the scene to say, hey, look at me, watch the miracles I can do, watch the things that I can prove, or look at me because I'm right, I'm on God's side. Elijah was on the scene like any prophet to primarily remind the people, you are out of covenant with God. Get it together. That's the job of the prophet. All the other things come with that, of course, and we see the miracles with Elijah. But the primary responsibility, remember we said last time, they are not a divine fortune teller. They don't have a little 8-ball that they shake to see what the result's going to be. They get that insight and that future insight, which, by the way, has to be 100% correct. Do you remember what happens to a prophet in Old Testament times if they get it wrong? You had one job and you got it wrong. You're done. You're going to get taken outside the city walls. You're going to get stoned. People say that there's people today that are prophets. There are no more prophets, by the way. And I realize that I will have probably a couple different people approach me outside of this study. Nobody here will do it. But some people will say, I know there's prophets today. Don't be mistaken. There is the gift of prophecy through the Holy Spirit. There are the works of the Holy Spirit that include prophetic gifts. But I'm talking the prophets. A lot of times you'll see some of these big promotions for people that have these word of faith seminars and things like that. And they'll actually call themselves prophet so-and-so. I would warn you to be very careful of that. We're talking about Old Testament prophets here, obviously Elijah specifically. So you want to be very careful when you're using those words. We don't throw them around very loosely. When it comes to Elijah, we did some comparisons last week, and a lot of times we do that just for fun, also just to help you kind of tie it in. But we left off with something that's, I got to be honest, has been eating at me, and it was a question that somebody, I won't name their name, they asked, who's Gary Cooper? Not saying any names. And so, yes, obviously we did a little bit of artwork with Gary Cooper that had tied him in to look like Elijah if we were making a movie about Elijah using Gary Cooper. But as it turns out, there's some other comparisons I want to make tonight just to help tie this in, because when we get into this next story about Elijah, it is his high water mark, to be sure, with the exception of the farewell scene that we'll probably get to if the Holy Spirit directs. What happens in this next story, you've heard probably 1,000 sermons on. We could spiritualize it and be on this kick for 2 years if we wanted to. I really want to just kind of give you the historical side and some of the background tonight, and then you can explore that on your own. That way we're not in this for 2 years, because this story alone, probably about 25, 26 verses we'll cover tonight, Lord willing. It's pretty deep. It goes deep into a lot of different things, and you could probably read it 100 different times and come up with 10,000 different messages out of it, because it does go deep. It's very multi-layered. But as we make these comparisons and get into the historical context and what was happening at the time, I want to give you an idea, and I want you to kind of compare it to our day. Something else that happened in 1952 besides the publication of Mere Christianity is the release of something else that only a few of you might be familiar with. My wife, she will not. So if we could play that clip, please.
The judges left town, Harvey's quit, and I'm having trouble getting deputies.
People gotta talk themselves into law and order before they do anything about it. Maybe because down deep they don't care. They just don't care.
I think you better go while there's still time. It's better for you and it's better for us.
Amy.
I mean it. If you won't go with me now, I'll be on that train when it leaves here.
I've got to stay.
Why must you be so stupid? Have you forgotten what he is? Have you forgotten what he's done to people? Have you forgotten that he's crazy? Don't you remember when he sat in that chair and said, "You'll never hang me, I'll come back. I'll kill you, Will Ken. I swear it, I'll kill you."
A terror-stricken town left him to face 4 killers, single-handed, at high noon. With every swing of the pendulum, with every second, a man's life ticked away. Never have so few moments held such excitement.
Miller!
What kind of woman are you? How can you leave him like this? Does the sound of the guns frighten you that much?
How many know it? Greatest westerns of all time. Brother Glenn, you don't know this movie? I thought for sure you would have been hooting and hollering. So a few of you know the story, and you say, what on earth does this have to do with Elijah? Well, first of all, I did have to show it for my wife, so now she knows a little bit. I could have done that at home, I guess. But actually, there is more of a story here. A couple things about this movie. Well, first of all, this movie was unlike any Western that came out in its day. Up to that point, they had followed kind of a similar pattern, even going back to some of the silent films. And when this gets released, it gets some mixed reviews. One of its biggest detractors was the role that Gary Cooper played as Marshall Will Kane. Gets offered that part first. It's John Wayne. Anybody ever heard of John Wayne? A couple of you maybe. John Wayne. He turns it down. He kind of saw a little narrative hidden in there that maybe was speaking about blacklisting. Remember back in the day, the House Un-American Committee was looking for communists and running people out of Hollywood and getting people to tell on their friends and colleagues, etc. Well, John Wayne didn't want any part of anything that could be misconstrued, that could be seen as maybe a anti-blacklisting kind of film. So he stepped away from it, and he regretted it a little bit later. Gary Cooper, who was very cooperative with the Committee on House Un-American Activities, he was a conservative Republican, by the way. You don't see many of those in the feature films these days, but he takes on the role. And it's interesting because what changes in this formula is, and it kind of shocked people. You got to keep in mind, an audience in 1952, that anybody old enough that they went and actually saw this in 1952? Nobody? All right. Pastor, he was not. Nice try. His second birthday. So as audience are watching this, they realize that, okay, this is different than Westerns where you have so many chases and gunfights and brawling. What happens is, yeah, you've got that climax at the end with that showdown. But what the storyline does is this. If I don't do it justice, forgive me, I'm just going to rush through the brief summary. Is you have Gary Cooper playing Marshall Will Kane, who's wanting to retire from law enforcement. He's recently married to a Quaker woman, and his plan is retire, go to town, leave town, go off and be happy. Here's the problem. He's got this bad guy, Frank Miller, who's getting out of prison. He's coming in on the noon train. Remember that. That's why it's called High Noon. And now here's the problem. Everyone in town is scared of this guy, and his gang is waiting there at the station for him to arrive. And when he gets there, he's probably going to try to settle a score with the judge who sent him there, who takes off on a horse, leaves town, and of course the marshal, played by Gary Cooper. And here's the problem, is that Gary Cooper, aka Marshall Kane, he's going to all of these townspeople to get help. He can't get anybody to help him. They have all turned their backs on him. It's kind of an Elijah moment. He's gone, I alone am here. I'm the only one who understands justice and truth and duty and honor. I'm the only one. He's a little bit like Elijah, I think, in that sense. And he does get one person that says, well, I'll help, but this guy's blind and he's a drunk, and it's not going to really be a help. He gets a 14-year-old boy come to him and says, I'm going to help. And he admires his courage, but he can't have a 14-year-old boy helping him out with this. And one by one, everyone abandons him, even his own deputy. And the one guy that was going to help him out realizes he's the only one, and he says, yeah, I'm going to have to step out on this one. And so we get into this very climax building situation where this story builds and builds and builds because we don't know what's going to happen. Is the marshal going to have to face this notorious outlaw and his gang by himself? And he does feel alone in this. But he's got courage, and he understands honor, and he understands duty. And if you really, really get into the movie, and I highly recommend it, by the way, if you get into the movie, you may see some things that might remind you of Elijah. You saw the one part where the judge mentioned just in the trailer, he says, people just don't care. Pretty telling statement. What we had in Israel's time is a nation of people who just didn't care. They knew they were out of covenant. They knew they were replacing the system that they had with the true God by bringing in this form of Baal worship, a people who just didn't care. Is it any wonder that Elijah at some point says, I and I alone, it is just me? He probably really thought that. Sometimes we might feel like that, maybe in our workplace, maybe in our families. We may feel like I am the only one. I'm the only one not part of the dirty joke being told in the break room, or I am the only one who is in my school that maybe prays over a meal. Maybe they make fun of me for that. Maybe they know my beliefs and they're talking behind my back. We all end up feeling at some point like we are that one person, the only voice, the only one that understands what covenant with God looks like, and the only ones who are courageous enough to not hide that and go in under the radar, because we can do that as Christians. We can sneak past. We can work our way into organizations and go through life, and maybe nobody would ever know that you're a Christian. I hope that's not the case for you, because there will be a day when there may be some accountability and you may get asked the question, maybe by that very person that might say to you, why did you never tell me? So it's very hard to do, and it's a difficult position we put ourselves in. I talked with somebody today that was in that situation for 5.5 years at their former job, and when I tell you they were in enemy territory, believe me, they were in enemy territory. I can't tell you where they were because it would give it away, but I can tell you it was an academic setting, and they were in hostile areas because they're a believer. So it made it very tough for them. So when we look at this story and we think of that famous verse from it's going to be verse 22 of 1 Kings 18, by the way, if you want to know where that actually is, we really kind of empathize with that character played by Gary Cooper. So yet another reason why I wanted to tie that in, and yes, I did use AI yet again. We've got Gary Cooper if he were playing Elijah, and then I threw a couple other people in there, as they have in Jezebel. You can figure that part out. So we can probably go on to the next slide before I get myself in any trouble. And we'll talk a little bit, again, we want to look at a historical look, and so you understand some of the facts and details, and you can dig into a lot more of this on your own. We just won't have the time tonight, but I do encourage you to really take a deep dive on this one. This is going to be the area where we're talking about. I've not been there. Bob, Pastor, you've been to Israel. Have you been to Mount Carmel? Is that one of the stops you made? Pastor and Bob both. They're on the Mediterranean Sea, and I guess this range runs about 30 miles to the southeast, I believe it is. And so this is the area. They don't know exactly where Elijah was, by the way, when this contest happens. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we'll get to that here in just a minute. But this is going to be, when you read about those high places of Baal, I found pictures in this study that I hadn't seen before, and maybe our pastor and Bob have seen these live, of altars that are still there, broken down altars that go back, way, way back, that I'm sure are probably littering that mountain range. I understand there's probably around 2,000 caves in this area. So no wonder Elijah is able to hide himself pretty well during this period of time, along with those other prophets that we read about last time that Obadiah was hiding. We can probably go on to the next slide, if we would, brother. Keep in mind, we're talking about, this is King Ahab again. He's getting a nice cozy seat, watching from a distance. Keep in mind, he's brought his prophets there to see what's going to happen. Elijah has come out to meet him. And before we go too far, let me get into that part of it first. We left off at verse 19. I'm just going to pick up there again as a refresher. In 1 Kings 18, verse 19, It says this, now therefore send, this is Elijah, now therefore send and gather to me all Israel unto Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal 450, and the prophets of the groves 400, which eat at Jezebel's table. So those are going to be the Asherah prophets that were under Jezebel. Everybody thinks of the 450 prophets of Baal, but we're actually talking 850 altogether if you combine the two. Verse 20 says this, so Ahab sent unto all the children of Israel and gathered the prophets together unto Mount Carmel. And Elijah came unto all the people and said, how long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. And the people answered him not a word. So a couple interesting things. If you go into this study, that Hebrew word pasak, when he's talking about halting between two opinions, an interesting study on that, you may find a little play on words, because what it means in the Hebrew is to limp. And so we may see that this is a reference to that limping and back and forth that those prophets do. We also understand that it does mean a physical limping. It's used to, in 2 Samuel, to refer to Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, who is crippled. And so we understand that it implies something that is lame, but it also has been taken to understand that it describes the bouncing back and forth, because it can be used in different contexts to mean crossover and things like that. But one person said it also indicates the movement of a bird who goes from one branch to another, just back and forth, and just can't settle on one of those branches. So what is Elijah saying here? He's saying to these people, make up your minds. What are you doing here? How long are you going to keep this up? What is it going to take for you to finally land on your feet and get with it? Get it together. So an interesting study for you to do again on your own, but I didn't want to miss out on that one because it's so rich. It's a very rich verse to read. Verse 22 says this, then said Elijah unto the people, I only remain a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. So here we have this Will Cain moment. He's Marshal Will Cain. Just me. I guess it's me against the world. Verse 23, let them therefore give us 2 bullocks, and let them choose 1 bullock for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on wood, and put no fire under. And I will dress the other bullock, and lay it on wood, and put no fire under. Verse 24 says, and call ye on the name of your gods, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God that answereth by fire, how many have heard that before? The God that answers by fire, let him be God. And all the people answered and said, it is well spoken. And Elijah said unto the prophets of Baal, choose ye 1 bullock for yourselves, and dress it first, for ye are many, and call on the name of your gods, but put no fire under. Verse 26 says, and they took the bullock which was given them, and they dressed it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, nor any that answered, and they leaped upon the altar which was made. So now this is when they really spaz out, because nothing is happening, and they're going to go berserk. So they're going to lose their minds. And as we go to the next slide, one of the highlights of this story is in verse 27. And it came to pass at noon, at high noon probably, that Elijah mocked him and said, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is talking, or he's pursuing, or he's in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth and must be awaked. So he's using this irony. It's what they call a taunt. He's taunting them. How many have heard trash talk before? How many have used trash talk before? Nobody. Nobody goes to sports games? Because we do, and I hear it all the time from my wife. Just kidding. We're not those parents, I promise. We're definitely not those parents, but we do get to see them quite often, and it's not actually very funny. All right, verse 28. By the way, there are some scholars who have put forth the idea, depending on the translation you're using, that he's actually being really downright, almost juvenile in his sarcasm, because they're saying that he's really essentially saying maybe he's busy going to the bathroom. There is a case for that, and we could get into that if we really have the time, but there is a case for that, so if you look that up on your own, it might be worth studying, it might be a little enjoyable. Verse 28 says this, and they cried aloud and cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets until blood gushed out upon them. So this is not uncommon in the pagan world. We talked about all those different denominations, essentially, different cities that would have a different Baal with a name attached to it. And verse 29 says this, and it came to pass when midday was past, and they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that there was neither voice nor any one to answer, nor that any regarded. Verse 30 says, And Elijah said unto all the people, Come near unto me. And all the people came near unto him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. So this is pretty interesting, because when we look at this and really kind of pick it apart, there's a lot that we might miss if we just skim over verse 30. But I just want to give you a couple highlights in case you do study this on your own, because when he's saying that the prophets of Baal have all failed, that none of this is working, which he knew was going to happen. Remember, he had courage, he had faith, he demonstrated all these things, just like we're going to see in the Marshall Will Kane type, and the type of person that we should be praying to be. The courage, the faith, the sense of duty, because there are a number of things that Elijah could have been doing differently. Will Kane wanted to retire and go off with his new bride and not have to deal with law enforcement anymore. I will not be dealing with law enforcement in 3 years, 8.5 months, not that I'm counting. But he wanted to go off and retire, not deal with this, let somebody else do it. I have every reason to believe that Elijah probably, since he was a man just like us, had moments where he probably thought, it really could have been somebody else doing this, but this is what the Lord wants me to do. So what do we call that? We call that obedience. He's been obedient to God. So it's no surprise to him that this has failed. He's taking his instructions straight from the Lord. But he's also built this altar. He's taken these 12 stones, which the author was nice enough to explain. Each one represents the tribes of Israel. And there's something interesting in that. The author does explain that to us. But there's a little more. If we go just a little bit past the surface, what we find out is, hang on a second, we've been looking at this from a historical point of view. There is not one Israel. There is Israel and there is Judah. We have a divided kingdom, right? Two tribes in one, 10 in the other. What is he saying by doing this, I wonder? 12 stones. Why didn't he just pick out 10 stones? He's in Israel, for crying out loud. Well, it's God's way of expressing to us through the Holy Spirit that his covenant people are one. Everything that has happened, the civil war that took place, and all the fallout from that was man's doing. And it started with what? Covenant breaking. And now here we are, and God is saying to Elijah, he's directing him to have 12 of these stones. God's people are one. God sees his covenant as being one, as being completely fine on one side, on his end of it. He's kept his end of the bargain. It's been the people who have broken that covenant. He also, if you notice, he's going to do this towards the time of the evening sacrifice. And again, if you go, wait a minute, we talked about this for a second. The capital here is not Jerusalem, because we're not in Judah. We're in the north. We're in Israel. The evening sacrifice is done where? At the temple in Jerusalem. So there still is this observation that he's doing. He knows the time of the evening sacrifice, even though it's been almost 100 years since David sat on the throne. And for the last 50 years, those sacrifices for Israel have not been made there. The sacrifices for Judah are being made in Jerusalem. But the sacrifices for Israel for the last 5 decades almost are being made elsewhere. Yet God is saying, we're still going to do this because my covenant doesn't change. Remember what Malachi wrote down for us from the Lord? He said, I am the Lord, I change not, right? He does not change. Verse 31 says this, And Elijah took those 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, unto whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be thy name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench about the altar as great as would contain 2 measures of seed. And he put the wood in order, and cut the bullock in pieces, and laid him on the wood, and said, Fill 4 barrels with water, and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood. Now he seems like he's just showing off, right? He's going to douse this thing with water. Verse 34, And he said, Do it the second time. And they did it the second time. And he said, Do it the third time. And they did it the third time. And the water ran round about the altar, and he filled the trench also with water. So he's got a moat around this altar with this saturated, sopping wet sacrifice that is to be consumed by fire. No trickery here. He's not really showing off. He's going to prove that there are no tricks here, that it is going to be the power of God that does this. Verse 36 says, And it came to pass at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near and said, Lord God, of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel, let it be known this day that thou art God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that I have done all these things at thy word. Verse 37, Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is the God." And Elijah said unto them, "Take the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape." And they took them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon. And what did he do? He slew them there. If you look at your timelines, you're going to probably have to reprogram how you've been thinking about Elijah, because you realize he's not an old man with a big long white beard. Elijah is, get ready for it, Elijah's a warrior. Elijah's a pretty tough dude, as it turns out. The picture that we get in our Sunday school coloring books might show a different Elijah, but that's not really Elijah. Elijah's kind of a bad dude. Maybe think of him, if you don't get down with Gary Cooper, maybe think of him as the Macho Man Randy Savage or somebody like that. I don't think he had the sunglasses or headbands. Juan, am I thinking of the right person? He is a tough guy. And by the way, he actually probably would have had a pretty rewarding contract with the WWE, because this guy, he could trash talk. And he would call people out. He wasn't afraid of that. And as far as I can remember, at least from when I was a kid, that's all that wrestling is, isn't it, Juan? It's trash talk and people ready to throw down. Elijah was one of those guys. That was that courage that came in. Now, I'm not telling you guys to leave here and go pick a fight with somebody. If you guys get in a fight, that's on your own. What I'm telling you is that Elijah was no weak old man. He was certainly no pushover. And it takes that to stand up to authority. It takes that to stand up to kings. We saw a little bit of that here in just the last few years, where we saw people cower to authority like that. I'm not talking about law. I'm talking about things like mandates and directives, where people completely shut down. They turned on their neighbors. They turned in their neighbors. They turned in their own churches. I hate to tell you this, but that's not the last of it. The religion that took over Israel is no different than what we're seeing today. And you can put different names on it. You can call it the occult if you just want a big blanket to throw over it and say it's all part of Mystery Babylon. But when we look at systems that replace religion, specifically the Christian faith, when we look at belief systems that deny the Word of God, it's a form of idolatry. It is no different than worshiping Baal Peor, Baal Zebub, whatever you want to call them. It's no different. It's the exact same thing. We just might call it something else today, like environmentalism or climate change, or whatever the case may be. And this is where I get really offensive, because sadly enough, those things that we've already experienced just in the last 3 or 4 years, they are going to come back again. And why is that, you say, Andy? Well, I'm not a prophet, so don't make any mistake there. And I don't have the gift of prophecy. I'm not telling you that either. But I do know this: we've got an election cycle coming up. And so here real soon, we're going to start seeing, somebody explain to me today that they saw on the news, which I don't really watch, but they saw somewhere, I think maybe one of the New England states, they've already got third graders back in N95 masks. What does that mean to us? Well, here's what it means to us. The last election cycle, we saw mandates, we saw riots, we saw all kinds of civil unrest. I wonder if there's a connection, or I wonder if I just need to have a tinfoil hat and you guys can just throw me out and tell me I'm a lunatic. Maybe a little of both, I don't know. But what I can tell you is this election cycle that we've seen, the last several election cycles, always brings in some kind of civil chaos and civil unrest. What it is going to take from the church, because we didn't see it in every church. We had a pastor that leaned on God and not the Department of Health. He leaned on God and not the White House. He leaned on God and not the popular opinion and all the voices that were telling him otherwise. Not every church had that. I learned of one today that is nearly completely shuttered, that went from 1,000 people because that pastor caved to the culture. And he shut down, and when people begged, let us come in your sanctuary to pray, we're not going to get sick, please, we want to pray, we want to gather, he said no. Now, I'm not judging anybody that for whatever decision you might have made or wherever you landed in 2020, that's not what this is about. What I'm telling you is that that was just a dry run. The things that are coming, probably starting with this election cycle, and maybe they'll kind of ebb and flow and diminish a little bit until the next cycle, or maybe this will be a big springboard to what's coming next as the clock runs down for planet Earth. We don't really know. All we can look for is for Jesus. We know he's coming back. But in the meantime, we have to look for the courage. We have to pray for the courage of an Elijah, because it's going to take standing up to those authorities. It's going to be standing up to those people that tell you things that are antithetical to our biblical foundations. They will be under attack in the next couple years, unlike anything we've ever seen before. There will be moments where you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm alone. There is nobody. Maybe my church family, but I can't get to them, or something has happened. I'm all alone. But you're not alone. We need the courage of Elijah, because those days are coming. Where did we leave off, guys? I'm so sorry for that. Obviously, the fire is consumed. I think verse 39 is where we left off, so we'll pick up in 40. And Elijah said unto them, take the prophets. I'm sorry, we read that. So they have been killed. Verse 41, and Elijah said unto Ahab, get thee up, eat and drink, for there is a sound of an abundance of rain. So Ahab went up to eat and to drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, and he cast himself down upon the earth and put his face between his knees. And he said to his servant, go up now, look toward the sea. And he went up and looked and said, there is nothing. And he said, go again 7 times. The rains are going to be coming from the west. So if you think back to that picture we showed, that mountain range looking toward the Mediterranean, looking toward the west, is where he's directed his servant to go. Verse 44 says this, and it came to pass at the 7th time that he said, behold, there ariseth a little cloud out of the sea like a man's hand. And he said, go up, say unto Ahab, prepare thy chariot, and get thee down, that the rain stop thee not. And it came to pass in the meanwhile that the heaven was black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. It's about 25 miles away. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Israel. So he's tucked everything into his belt and has this supernatural speed and is able to get there ahead of Ahab's chariot, even though it's a distance of about 25 miles, another supernatural event in the life of Elijah. So that finishes out chapter 18. Believe it or not, we are trucking right through, but we're not getting in too big of a hurry. We've got one last slide left, and this one was just cool. It's something that I had found that I wanted to show. We don't really have a whole lot to add to this. That is the high water mark of the career of Elijah, but his story is not done. Jezebel, as you notice, was ominously missing from our story tonight. She was not at Mount Carmel. She's back in Jezreel, as we just said. Why did the Lord take Elijah there? Any guesses? Nobody knows. There's no real right answer. We don't know. Why did he supernaturally get him to Jezreel, 25 miles away? Was it so he could break the news to Jezebel? I'm not sure. But her wrath is yet to come, because she has been humiliated now. So the story for Elijah does not end here. There is much more to come. His work is not quite finished yet, so we'll have to stay tuned for a little bit more of that. All right. Did I miss any questions or anything? I know there's a lot to cover, but again, there's a lot of history to unpack, and if you can dig into more on your own, I would encourage that, because there's so much of the spiritual to get into with that entire story. All right. Brother Ron has something here, Chelsea, if you don't mind. Yeah. Hey, at least you know he listens to the Sunday sermons.
When Elijah was raptured out, I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Did he actually see the throne of God or the holiness of God? I know it says a fiery chariot, but is he the only one who ever actually saw?
Well, that's a spoiler alert. I think everybody here knows that he was taken away in that chariot. We are going to get to that. That's going to be a big study. So when we said tonight's the high water mark, it's a great question from Brother Ron. We're going to unpack that one when we get to that, because again, that's probably of the things that you remember. You may not always remember he went to Zarephath, or that he had this raising, this first resurrection we see in Scripture, but what we do remember is the contest with the prophets of Baal, and then what I keep calling his farewell, just in case we have somebody listening who doesn't know about what Brother Ron said, because that's going to be pretty interesting and ties into a lot of things. My time is up, I think. I'll let you give prayer requests to Pastor. If there's no other questions, I'll turn it over to him. Thank you all for listening. I will see you Sunday, Lord willing, and don't forget to love each other.
Good job, Andy. All right.
Thanks, Pastor. Thank you.
Just a little announcement here. As you know, our sister church starts a revival Sunday night down in Delaware. So next Wednesday, he won't be able to unpack all of those things that he wanted to unpack, because we're going to dismiss services here and join them down in their revival on Wednesday night, this coming Wednesday night. I would tell you, Sunday night I'm preaching, but that's the only thing I know about the whole entire revival. I don't know who's singing or who's preaching. Other than Sunday night, it's me. I don't expect you to go Sunday night, because you'll be hearing me Sunday morning. But then again, I'll be taking names should you not. Yeah, what's up? I'm sorry? Oh, Tony is preaching. Okay. But they're in revival this week, so we're going to try to support them if we can. And so I just wanted to make that announcement. Also, on Wednesday night, most of you know we take those dollars in. Well, what we're going to do is we're collecting those dollars now and till probably the 1st of November to go to LifeWise. It is to help them put Christian teaching in the schools. We're going to divide the money up between Fredericktown, Mount Gilead, and Highland. Yeah, and so tell us where your children are going. We're going to try to get something started there for them, so that basically what happens is at noontime, they do a lot of announcing it. They'll come, they'll get the kids, they'll take them to a place, give them a lunch, and then teach them about the Lord, and then take them back to the school. And they have been granted a bus to do that with, so on and so forth. I think they had to buy the bus. They weren't granted, they had to buy the bus. But all of that stuff is starting up soon. Did you have a question?
I think it's to sponsor a child is $20 a month.
It might be. If you wanted to sponsor a child, it'd be $20 a month. And we're going to try to, how would you say, have some scholarships so that somebody couldn't. So the church is going to gather money to use this as part of our way of supporting that organization, so that our kids will get a little bit more teaching about the Lord throughout the week. So, no other questions? I'm going to let you go right away, because it's certainly past 8:15. You all know when I taught, we always got out right on